This Zoom meeting is being recorded. Western Sydney University Library will record this Zoom webinar for publishing on its website. Participation in the chat and/or question-answer sections of the Zoom webinar is completely optional. By participating in the chat, you consent to the information shared in these sessions being collected and used by Western Sydney University for learning purposes and to build a catalogue of thought leadership event videos. Any personal information collected by Western Sydney University during the Zoom webinar will be handled in accordance with its privacy policy and privacy management plan, which can be accessed online. With respect for Aboriginal cultural protocols, Western Sydney University Library acknowledges the traditional custodians of the unceded lands and waterways on which our libraries are located and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. The university works across many different lands, and we are currently on the lands of the Burramatagal people of the Darug Nation. We celebrate the knowledge and living cultures of Indigenous Australians and acknowledge their important contribution to teaching, learning and research. We acknowledge that the activities currently delivered across our campuses are a continuation of teaching and learning that has occurred on these lands for tens of thousands of years. We also pay our respects to any First Nations people in the meeting. In this spirit, we welcome any guests to the meeting. Hello and welcome to the 9th Public Thought Leadership event in the series hosted by Western Sydney University Library. Western Sydney University was placed first in the world in the 2022 and 2023 Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, the only global performance measure that assesses universities against United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The event series aims to celebrate and promote this #1 ranking, complementing work being undertaken across the university as part of its Sustainability and Resilience Decadal Strategy 2030. I'll hand over to my colleague Badra Chandran to introduce today's speakers.
Thank you, Emma. Thanks, Emma. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and a warm welcome to the 9th event in our Thought Leadership series. Today, we have the privilege of hosting two esteemed speakers, Professor Pedram Khosronejad and Mrs. Helga Girschik Griffin. Let me begin by introducing our first speaker, Professor Pedram Khosronejad. Professor Khosronejad is an adjunct professor in the Religion and Society Research Cluster at Western Sydney University. With a specialization in social anthropology, he has dedicated his research to understanding and engaging with diverse communities in Western Sydney and Parramatta. His commitment to promoting intercultural understanding and dialogue has made him a prominent figure in the field of social science. Now, let me introduce our second speaker, Mrs. Helga Girschik Griffin. Mrs. Griffin is a remarkable individual, a highly educated working mother who has made significant contributions in various spheres. Mrs. Griffin's works include serving as a research editor with the Australian Dictionary of Biography at the Australian National University, involvement in teaching race relations, serving with the ACT branch of the Executive Committee of the Australian Human Rights Council, and playing a pivotal role as one of the community representatives on the federal branch of the Commonwealth Immigration Review panels. Today's presentation marks the culmination of a remarkable collaboration between Professor Khosronejad and Mrs. Griffin. Together, they have worked tirelessly to illuminate a significant chapter in history, focusing on the civilian Germans from Persia, that's current Iran, who were brought to Australia as families and detained in Tatura's internment camp number 3 from 1941 to 1946. Through their joint efforts, they aim to raise awareness about the conditions faced by these families who lived in detention but were effectively treated as prisoners. To enhance your understanding and connection to this historical period, an exhibition is on display showcasing objects from Mrs. Griffin's family collection that were collected during their internment. After the event, Mrs. Griffin will be available for signing copies of her book, At Home in Exile, which offers an account of her family's experiences and will be available for purchase. We are truly privileged to have both Professor Khosronejad and Mrs. Griffin here today, sharing their expertise and personal insights with us. Their collaboration is a testament to the power of interdisciplinary research and the importance of preserving and sharing untold stories from our history. Without further ado, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Khosronejad and Mrs. Griffin. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I would like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting today on the lands, skies, and waters of the Darug people and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and recognize their continuous connection to country. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, and family members in room, and also those who are online with us from Sydney, Australia, and other parts of the world. I especially welcome First Nation colleagues, friends, and audiences to our today's program. I would like to express my deepest appreciation to Ms. Emma Buddington and Ms. Bahadra Chandran for inviting us and organizing this unique event. Thank you so much. I'm also extremely grateful to Professor Brian Stude, the Dean, and Professor Adam Pasamoe, Deputy Dean School of Social Sciences at Western Sydney University. Without their support, we could not run and continue this research project in Australia since 2019. I also would like to thank all my colleagues, members of our projects who are here and online for their collaboration and working together since 2019. Thank you so much. In this occasion, I also would like to thank National Archives of Australia, National Library of Australia, Australian War Memorial, Tatura Irrigation and Wartime Camps Museum, the Berry-Barmera Council, Lovely Internment Camp Committee in South Australia, and Temple Society of Australia. A special thanks goes to the friend of our project, Tim Stackpole, who is here with us today. Thank you, Tim. And in the end, thank you, dear Helga, to come from Canberra to share with us your exceptional childhood memories. As my colleague told you, this afternoon program divided on some sections. I try to briefly tell you. I have a short introduction to introduce you to the project and a little bit historical methodological background, and then invite dear Helga to share with us her talk. So until today, the lives and fate of 512 German civilians of Persia, today Iran, the imprisoned inhabitants of Australian World War II confinement centers, and the roles that they and their family members, 600 wives and children, played in the development of post-war Australia have been ignored by all. It was during August 2019 that I met some of the children of the German expatriate colony of Persia, today Iran, Australians who had been detained with their parents in Iran, my country, in 1941 after the country's invasion by the British and Soviet armies during the World War II. 512 of them, single males, and 6 families with their children, which the only eldest female is Helga today among us, and the only male is her youngest brother. No one survived of those internees. Were sent to Australian internment camps while the rest of the women and children were forced to separate from their husbands and return to Germany during the war from Iranian soil. In 1947, after the war, some of these internees were deported or repatriated to Germany while many were able to stay in Australia, although they had to find employment in order to make enough money to pay for the return of their families. The case is dear Roswitha and John Wolf, who are here together. They returned to Australia by their mother and their sister. It was only in 1949 that most of the women and children were able to rejoin their husbands and continue to live together in Australia. The research project should be considered the first multidisciplinary academic attempt at the collection of the socio-cultural history and memories of this special group of civilian German detainees and migrants of Australia through their heritage and the roles that they played in the development of the country after the World War II. This research project, our project, investigates the role of intangible childhood memories and autobiographies and tangible family photo albums, personal diaries, letters, and art of the camp, intangible heritage in the life and resettlement of German civilian internees and prisoners of war in post-war Australia, in our case study, Germans of Iran. In particular, our research aims to investigate how today the children and descendants of those Germans of Iran who have been living in Australia since 1940s remember and reconstruct their memories with the help of migration mementos. The overarching argument that this project follows is the multifaceted role and multifunctional usage of the tangible and intangible heritage of migrants as coping strategies during harsh life experiences such as deportation, imprisonment, forced migration, and resettlement. In the past 6 decades, Australia, like other countries in the global north, has received a growing number of Middle Eastern prisoners of war, refugees, immigrants, and asylum seekers. The importance of their tangible and intangible heritage to such migrants is a global phenomenon and gives them a sense of identity and integration within the host and homeland society. Thus, migrant heritage can stretch beyond borders and across generations. And today, communities who may not identify as migrants themselves recognize migrant heritage in their own families. Migrant heritage offers a different entry point to the ongoing connections between peoples in different locations and the shared sense of belonging and communal identity that can flourish from those connections. Our project feeds into growing academic debate in response to an urgent need to engage multicultural migrant communities to move beyond previous classical ideas of collaboration and towards co-design and participation. This project brings together multidisciplinary approach to the questions about the participation of Middle Eastern war migrant communities in Australia and the reciprocal collaboration in the practice of building and representing their migrant and family heritage, with a special emphasis on migrant heritage and approach that attempt to privilege and center non-expert voices. Our project is a unique case study of cultural self-representation by members of the war migrant population of Australia, Helga, Roswitha, John, and goes beyond group negotiation and moves towards reciprocal anthropological collaboration, a practice that allows migrant participants agency in producing and controlling their narratives. And what today we are going to hear from Helga, this is a type, one of the samples of 10 members of our project, and the testimonial Helga will talk more about these things too. Therefore, our project draws on the reach and overlapping fields of both theory and practice relating to sociocultural anthropology, heritage studies, memory and migration, and its urgency reflects the high stakes of the topic at hand in today's Australia. Working on migrant heritage constructed within, beyond, and between borders. Therefore, our project responds to the challenge of how to bring Australian aged war migrants and refugees, prisoners of war, academics, and policymakers and stakeholders together to engage with migrant heritage as the political, cultural, and social processes of representing and preserving migratory experiences, the temporal and spatial dimensions of mobility and its emotional, familial, and community aftermath, both tangible and intangible. Our projects also provides a high-quality piece of research on a new and significant topic by expanding Australia's knowledge-based and research capability, especially through engaging elderly people in exceptional high-quality research environments. The results of this project will help, we hope, the understanding of the challenges and provide opportunities for support and improvement in Australia's increasing endeavors in dealing with war immigrants. This project offers an innovative critical examination of the role of migrant heritage as a medium for evoking coping strategies, an often overlooked aspect of Australian immigration strategy. It shows how through a combination of scholarly and innovative methods, the study of heritage of World War II migrants in Australia could be used as a roadmap to design new governmental strategies to help and support immigrants today. But the topic of human rights, which is very important regarding our talk series. Anthropology and human rights, they have long relationship. Anthropologists' encounter with human rights is not and never has been one thing, a consensus, but is rather a thing of two sides or even a multiplicity of different types of approaches. Anthropology has been torn between analytic and critical dispositions toward human rights, as Martinez brings, and divided about what substantive matters matter most, even as convergence around theory and method has been discernible since the late 90s. Therefore, no single overview may capture the diversity of subfield of anthropology of human rights. I would like today, by this example, raise this important question: how anthropology as a discipline and how anthropologists as actors of this discipline will be getting engaged with the human rights and its related subfields. So I stop here, but just wanted to raise this question that today I think our projects show how reciprocal anthropology, a type of applied anthropology, we can work with community-based projects and bring the result of our reciprocal activities to the attention of public and make some even small changes and look at the impact. And this is what we hope to create, bring to the attention. And the result, as you can see, Helga will go through that in detail. And also the exhibition that you can see here is a type of not installation, is engagement, and will make sense for you after Helga's talk. I invite our dear Helga to deliver her talk for us. Thank you so much.
I wish to thank the organizers of this program who so generously invited me to speak here today. I will be speaking about my dislocated childhood and associated questions about social and personal justice. Discussion of legislation on human rights, I leave to the experts, like our friend here. I will also be speaking about a project into which I was recruited and its capacity to transform and heal. For those of you, thank you. For those of you who have not heard of my 5 years as a child in an Australian wartime detention camp, I will give a brief outline. My Austrian father, Rudolf Girschik, as a 23-year-old graduate in engineering from Vienna, rode his bicycle without gears with a male friend in June 1933 along the Danube River to the Black Sea and from there to Istanbul, looking for work in a seriously depressed economic depression. Rudolf found good work in Turkey and there met a German woman, Elfriede Bittner, whom he married and who gave birth to me in a Turkish village called Chankara. My parents took me to Persia when I was 9 months old. In Persia, my father worked for several years on establishing railways and their associated buildings, roads, bridges, and tunnels. My brother Peter was born in Tehran in 1938. When in 1941, during World War II, British and Russian soldiers invaded neutral Persia to preserve the oil and other essential materials from falling into German hands, all German workers and their families were deported. About 500 men were interned and sent to a secret destination in a camp in Basra, Iraq, and then by 2 ships in turn to wartime camps far away. Most of 600 women and children were deported to their original homelands, which was mostly Germany. Only 6 couples, including 4 children, were sent with the men overseas, each family, it seems, for different reasons. Here with us today are Roswitha and John Wolfe, and Ingrid Stephen is listening from Melbourne. They were separated from their fathers and their story is heartbreaking. It is much more traumatic than what I have to tell you today. In Australia, my family of 4 was interned in Tatura, northwest Victoria, together with numerous families deported from Palestine, where a different policy had been enacted. We 16 from Persia were a tiny minority within the family camp. We lived in Spartan military conditions, surrounded by coils and walls of barbed wire. At one time, there were about 960 of us in that camp. It was built for about 1,000 people, but the numbers fluctuated over the years. We were number 3 of 18 camps in Australia. The segregated men from Persia, like Roswitha and John's father, were sent to Loveday in South Australia. And I have to make the point that, like the convicts of 1788, we had been deported by the British by ship to be guarded in Australia. Some of those convicts for very silly little reasons. There was little privacy in our camp. Most activity was communal and in German, and most internal order was directed by the majority from Palestine. A few enemy aliens from other nations looked after themselves. We were interned until the end of the war and had to remain in camp until we could be released into Australian society if we chose to stay here. For us, it was an extra 18 months until December 1946. As our father could not find proper accommodation for us, my brother and I fortunately avoided going to an orphanage or being fostered by another family, because Catholic nuns took us in for nothing as school boarders for 1.5 years. At the time, my father's qualifications from Vienna and all his work in Iran was not accepted in a Commonwealth country like Australia. The greatest deal of my story can be found in my book, Sing Me That Lovely Song Again, which was published in 2006, and its unedited reprint as an e-book retitled At Home in Exile, published in 2022 by ANU Press. And that book can be read for nothing at ANU Press link. Now I raise the question, does civilian internment or detention constitute an abuse of human rights? In the early 1990s, I asked a long-term dear friend of mine, the barrister and human rights lawyer Nicholas O'Neill, if civilian internment during war can be seen as an abuse of human rights. He had recently co-authored and published with his associates a most detailed history on the application of human rights in Australia's justice system, and it was called Retreat from Injustice, Human Rights in Australia, published in 1994, 508 pages of it. Nick answered me at the time with a decisive no, that during war, civilian internment can be excused for reasons of national security. And at the time, although I wasn't quite sure, I tended to agree with Nick's interpretation that it was acceptable government practice. I think that at the time, neither the lawyers nor I had read much about civilian internment. The first academic study on Australian internment and the many camps appeared in published form in 1993 as Behind Barbed Wire, Internment in Australian during World War II by Margaret Beveridge. One reason for the lack of knowledge on this topic generally was during the war in Australia, the government shrouded the matter in secrecy. We were actually, the camps were all away from the sea to keep us away from escaping and from being in danger. After the war and their release, ex-internees tended not to want to talk about that period of their lives because there was far too much shame and trauma and profound regret in people's lives. We had all been enemy aliens. The label lingered post-war. I first began to talk publicly about my experiences in 1977. That was 32 years after the war had ended. I was 11 when the war ended, and I was 42 when I began to talk about it at a tertiary institute in North Queensland. And I thought it very important by that time. Later, during the 1980s, I wanted each member of my original family to write their account of the same situation, because after all, we were with the same people in the same camp for the same period of time, an impeccable laboratory for a social scientist. I wanted to know at the time how the same experience was remembered by a male, mature male, by a mature female, by a young girl and by a young boy, but nobody at the time wanted to do this. It needed a lot of courage actually to be public about our experiences. When I subsequently published my memoir in 2006, I started thinking about it in the 80s. My publication received much attention with 4 interviews by noted ABC radio journalists, 1 local radio interview, and a TV team to my house. A daughter rang me from Spain to say that there were over 50 references to the previously anonymous me on the Yahoo website. Such was a sudden interest in my information. In my book, I had not presented myself as a victim, nor featured the British system as abusive. Looking back in history, I could see quite clearly that Hitler's aggressive invasions abroad had caused the British allies of Russia to combine in an effort to stop fifth columnists in Persia, the country on which many German and Russian supplies depended, from entering there. Many pro-Nazi German civilians needed to be exported, the men and their families as well, to get out of the way. I therefore tended to agree with Nick. I had the same perspective. I saw it through an Australian lens. I saw it with my own subsequent experience, I suppose, of other people's stories. My view was also enhanced by my knowledge that in the Australian camps, we families were most courteously locked up by the Australian guards. They did extraordinary things, but they were really courteous to us. Had they been nasty to us, thinking as a social scientist, I thought we would have internally got together and been against the enemy. But as it was, we squabbled about among ourselves internally. I nevertheless began to realize that things were not quite as simple as all that. I had already thought that internment was simply another word for imprisonment, because we were actually treated as prisoners without having been convicted. We women and girls did not leave the 6.5 hectares of our camp for the 3 years of the war. And after the war, we were going once a month with a soldier and a gun. The men and the boys could occasionally help in the vegetable gardens for some money, or the soldiers outside. They had the occasional outing, but we women were totally locked up. But generally, anyone trying to escape at the time was placed into 28 days of solitary confinement. Does that sound like not being prisoners? Conceptually, we were prisoners, if not technically so. No doubt the Australian military guards were responsible for our safety on behalf of Britain. I mean, I could understand their position. Yet the whole thing was pretty ambiguous, I thought, because post-war, many of us were kept in detention, even if we wanted to stay in Australia. We couldn't actually leave the camp before we were settled somewhere. In my book, I give much evidence from memory how things were and how they happened to me. But I more or less left unexplored the question of human rights in my analysis of our situation. It was the project that Dr. Pedram Khosronejad recruited me for that has caused me to revise my experience, to review it at a deeper and broader level. I got to know others whose fathers had been separated from, they were interned here, and the wives and children were separated up to 8 years. A horrific story, actually, when you look into their tale compared to mine. I learned much from this interaction between the members of the group, as well as from our collection of writings. It was what Pedram had intended us to do, and for the project to deliver, to offer catharsis for bad memories, to externalize them in discussion and writing, and to heal oneself by educating ourselves as a group and with empathy for each other. I began to ask myself critical questions about justice. I'm not a lawyer, but in my mind is a common awareness of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. In short, its charter promoted security and liberty for all people, fair and respectful treatment of them, their freedom for religious practice, of public assembly, right to freedom of speech, and for political self-determination, which to us in Papua New Guinea was very important, the self-determination. The many Geneva Conventions, most notably 1949 and 1977, dealt with soldiers and war. It needs to be remembered, as O'Neill had it, that Australia is the only liberal democracy that does not have a national act or charter of human rights. And you may be surprised that Canberra, who gets a beating for being such a boring place, is the only state in Australia that actually has a Bill of Rights, which is quite a few years old now. Anyway, for that reason, I looked at the second edition of Nick O'Neill's book, which I will have just a hand up to show you. It's 750 pages of very tiny print. I haven't read it all. I dipped into it. It doesn't deal with the treatment of internees, but focuses on issues of detention in ordinary civilian life, which has a connection, as you can imagine, and particularly on the treatment of refugees and asylum seekers. And there's a lovely inscription in here by Nick. Regret that we haven't gone further in Australia than we have so far. Anyway, I'm going to ask 13 questions now related to human rights issues, but I won't call it human rights, I'll say issues of justice. 1, how legitimate is a military invasion of a neutral foreign country? Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium in May 1940 caused an uproar among the Allies. What of Britain's and Russia's invasion of Iran, a neutral country? And I want to say that at the time, Iran had been a powerful empire in the past. At that time, it was technologically underdeveloped compared to the people who were invading her. Was that invasion not also a problem? 2, what right do the invaders have to remove from Iran its professional guest workers and other persons and their families who had an impeccable relationship with Iranians and the Iranian regime? One of the Geneva Conventions lists deportation of non-combatants as one of 11 war crimes. Number 3, my family had all its documents like birth certificates and work references removed by the British soldiers. The documents were never returned. As Pedram pointed out to me, it rendered all of us as stateless persons. While post-war, my father was able to get copies of birth certificates for all our family except me, who was born in Turkey. I remained technically a stateless person until my naturalization in 1953, 12 years after my original internment. Ironically, I became an Australian citizen in 1953 by a suburban mayor and his deputy as the only person in the room without any proof of my identity. Later in life, it caused me some problems now and again not to have a birth certificate. But as Pedram said, how legitimate was it then to have one's proof of identity removed? Number 4, how appropriate was it for the German diplomatic authorities to agree on the separation of husbands and fathers from their wives and children in the interests of German women and children? Subsequently, communication by mail between families in Europe and their interned loved ones in Australia often took several months. Each way, that is. Sometimes parts of families didn't even know where the other part of the family was during that period. Post-war, the husbands had to raise the money, even though they are brought here for nothing. They had to raise the money to bring their to bring their wives and children to Australia if they decided to be reunited. How just was that arrangement? Number 5. O'Neill's book on page 239 cites, that's volume 2, I think, still cites the current British Bill of Rights of 1660, which states that cruel and unusual punishment like torture should not be inflicted on prisoners, commenting that the prisoners should not be degraded. The first journey to India of the circa 500 male internees of 1941 on the relatively small Rona, an Indian merchant ship, was degrading. The German civilian male internees for Persia slept in crowded conditions in hammocks below deck with little exposure to fresh air and shared a few toilets, maybe 4 or 5, with 500 people. There was a British soldier with a naked bayonet shepherding the people through the toilets to make sure nobody was in there too long. Was that not degrading? I certainly think so. Number 6. The journey from Persia to Australia was dangerous and life-threatening. We travelled between Ceylon and beyond Singapore with a convoy of 3 to 5 warships. My father's diary records it. German submarines and raiders were expected to be in the Indian Ocean. One Japanese submarine spotted us, and I remember very clearly how we were blacked out for 2 hours and very frightened as to what might happen. Of course, Japan hadn't entered the war at that time. On the day that we landed in Adelaide, the German troop carrier Sydney on the West Australian coast was shot. The German raider Corpsman shot the Australian troop ship on the West Australian coast and 600 men drowned. We had only been along that coast a few days earlier. I wonder, how just was it to endanger the lives of civilian internees by such a dangerous journey? Why didn't they send us somewhere closer? Why across the oceans in such dangerous ways? Number 7, I've already said that we internees entered a protected camp in Victoria, heavily surrounded by barbed wire to keep us locked inside. And if we tried to escape, we'd be in solitary confinement for 28 days. Were we technically not prisoners, but treated as prisoners without any conviction? Even we children were designated as enemy aliens, a shameful label for all of us and its echoes post-war. Number 8, to be deprived of the freedom for self-determination for 5 years without a conviction of illegal activity, surely in my mind as not a lawyer, defies the spirit of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Post-war, we even hid our language in public, so aware of having been the enemy, although some of us were not the enemy, but we're designated to be. Number 9, the atmosphere in camp, under incredibly cramped conditions with little privacy, created deep anxiety and various kinds of pressures associated with gossip, harassment, and political pressure. Many inmates in camp were loyal to Hitler. This is not often stated, and it's not something we talk about these days. It often put me on the outer with many of my age group. I was twice pelted with stones by a group of children for being different. I wanted to belong. I wanted to be with those Hitler kids, but my parents did not want me to belong. So I was caught in the middle in a way. And after the war was over, my parents said, you can belong to that youth league now. And I was in a state of total bliss to be accepted and to belong with them. Number 10, the camp was a promiscuous place. And so, you know, it had degrading features to it. My mother told an interviewer in 1992 in her graphic, analogous way that there were underpants under every bush. Boys were removed from the camp aged 18. Sexually mature boys were wandering about and playing with us girls in various concealed places. Although I do not recall having any amorous association with boys in camp, the possibility concerned my mother so deeply that for some time she inspected me intimately to see that my hymen had not been broken. My mother did not tell me why she was doing it. I found it horrible and degrading, and it had sexually repressive aspects to it, as you can imagine. Promiscuity can be a danger during internment in crowded and degrading conditions. Number 11. My interned father redirected I have great difficulty saying this to you, but it's part of the story, so I have to say these two degrading examples, that my father vented his frustrations against my brother and me. He acted savagely to the possibility of us children becoming disobedient and feral. He beat us mercilessly over slight misdemeanors. He once gave me 30 lashes for going barefooted against his instructions, and I could not sit down for 3 days. Our so loving father, whom we adored as very young children, had taken out his frustrations in us two children. He loathed being a captive and losing his career. Now I can understand his position better than I did then. I couldn't understand it at all. Number 12, I was also disadvantaged only in one important sense by the wonderful German camp in education. It was fantastic. I always spoke how fantastic it was. It was the best education I ever received, except for a couple of university subjects. It was wonderful. However, school began at age 7 in the German camp, but 5 in Australia. So I completed 4 years in the camp, and as an Australian, in an Australian school, I was put into year 7 high school. So I missed 2 years of schooling in a sense. The schooling where in Australia you learn all those important things like decimals and fractions. And I loved dealing with sums as a kid. I absolutely loved it. I was not brilliant at it, but it was something I really enjoyed greatly. And I missed all my connections. I couldn't do any maths after coming into an Australian school. So I missed my connection in jobs that had mathematics associated with them. I spent years making cardboard houses with my children and grandchildren. Had I studied architecture, my father would have related better to me and probably supported my university studies. We would have got on better, I think. 13, the last one. After we left the camp, shortage of housing obliged Peter and me to go to a Catholic boarding school on charity for 1.5 years. We were deeply beholden to the nuns and their religion, as you can imagine. We were away from home for the first time without any previous religion and without any English. I learnt my English with religious words like Eucharist, Shiborium, Limbo, Lent, Chasuble, Purgatory. As a pubescent female teenager, although loving school, I wanted to run away from life. I was so incredibly lonely. I wanted to become a nun, even to die at times. I mean, I've written about this, embarrassingly enough. I only began to find my confidence and stability when in 1953 I entered the workforce full-time to put myself through university part-time. Now I'm going to talk about the project, catharsis and the value of the collection. I've already made mention of Dr. Pedram Khosronejad, the Iranian-born social scientist, and the project he had designed. In late 2019 and early 2020, he recruited a number of us Australians of German background to work with him in a group. What most of us have in common is that our fathers had worked in Persia with great pleasure in the 1930s and were interned from there so far away into Australian camps. Now, I want to mention the name of a key member in our group, Doris Frank. She's an archivist, was born post-war, but had parents who each lived in different camps. They married and she was born after that. So she has an amazing oversight, an interest in both Loveday and the Tatura camps, which I didn't have. We each, in our group, donated many of our family's relevant archives, especially the Wolves, an enormous collection, into a collection to be housed safely in future in a research institute. Meanwhile, we will be using this collection as a basis for research with Dr. Khosronejad and our group. We are not a social club with an anthropologist, as someone said. Our numerous recordings and translations and essays are an aspect of Pedram's academic anthropology, which he shares with us and which has various dimensions. His overriding interest is as a visual anthropologist, dealing specifically here with the archives and material culture in our project's collection, photographs, letters, diaries, documents, artifacts. We have been working with him on this material a great deal. Then there is his exploration of reciprocal anthropology, which he has already mentioned, which promotes us in the group in an egalitarian relationship with him. He and we instruct each other. He is team leader, but he reminds us that it is our project, thus empowering us with a sense of ownership. Given the old age of members in our group, Pedram has also generated an anthropology of the elderly. In old age, we are invigorated by the project. I often refer to its transformative qualities. The symposium we staged recently as a group in Barmera in South Australia provides evidence of this transformative spirit. My own adult children in their 50s and 60s want to have a project like that in old age themselves because they've seen what it has done for me, invigorated me. The published anthropology essays given us by Pedram in his professional capacity have also provided us with insights into our own personal stories. Two of the many essays he shared with us speak of the value of material culture in prison or in detention. They refer to the need for prisoners and internees to create a home away from home to help them cope with dislocation. My mother did this instinctively with cloths and objects brought from Persia. She had called Persia her spiritual home, from which she had been removed against her will, and my father as well. We had 2 rooms in the camp. Two persons got 1 room in the camp, and it was made for about 1,000 people. But my mother decided to turn one of the 2 rooms into a bedroom where the 4 of us slept in double bunks, and the other room create this lounge room, this sense of home away from home with Persian things she had brought. I don't know how she was permitted to bring kilims and a samovar and a record player and so on. Just amazing. I actually wrote about this in my memoir before I met Pedram, saying how one day I told my brother to wipe his shoes before entering our salon. Many of the huts had Hitler's photo as a sense of home, in a different sense of home, of course. Photographs of home and freedom also helped me to cope at an Australian boarding school, age 11, and without any English. I consoled myself at night in bed by thinking of the photos in our Iranian photo albums. And I wrote about that too, and some of those are over there in the collection. I wrote about it long before I met Pedram, and he put things into a context for me. In a way, I learned from him something that I hadn't actually realized because of my father's savage and distant treatment of us. He never hugged us, for instance, that our father had loved us so deeply before we were interned. I was astonished that he should have the insight that I didn't actually have from looking at the photos. And he was actually quite right about that, because I remembered a whole lot of things then of my time spent with my father. The greatest distraction for us, of course, was the birth of Herbert, and he's there, the baby in that picture. His birth brought us many friends, what I call the Herbert Admiration Society, because he was such a cute baby, a real angel, really lovely. I also realized by this association how many practical skills I had acquired in the camp to help me cope, and how they've been an ongoing influence in my life. For instance, I don't think we have the oh yes, we have the handicraft book in the collection over there. Is one that was given to my mother in the camp, and I inherited it from her. But during the camp, when she had it, I began already to make things from it, and afterwards often made things with my children from various materials. And that's the kind of thing we learned in the camp to help us to cope. This is just a byline. My youngest granddaughter Gigi and I won a sculpture competition in her primary school in a project for children to work with grandparents on the topic of friendship. We copied paper maches from the book. You see the page there. And we made the puppet heads of the politicians, John Howard and Kevin Rudd, with a caption, "Can these two be friends?" We won the competition, both from the judge's decision and the amusement of the majority of parents who came to the show. And they put these puppets into a display cabinet. And I say maybe more politicians should be put behind the glass cabinets. Perhaps that's where many politicians belong. Creativity, says Dr. Khosronejad, helps us overcome malaise and trauma. It's certainly, I can stand by that. In other words, items in the collection of our internment memorabilia for this project still have a place to play, like this recorder, which I received in camp, which I've had for numerous years, of course, for over 70 years. The woman on the right-hand side of this picture, and that's another reason why I chose it, because in that picture, that's Lieselotte Strecker, who lived opposite us, offered to teach me to play it. I didn't ask her. She came over and said, "Helga, I think you're musical. I should teach you this instrument." So I may play you a famous old Christmas carol by Michael Pretorius, 1609, "Es ist ein Ros entsprungen," because imprisoned German officers from Camp 1 came into our camp and visited us families and presented a drama, which is extraordinarily touching for us, and we wept tears over it. Later, I used to play this instrument often in other places a long time ago. I'll play you an English tune now, La Volta, composed around the same time by William Byrd, which I was once invited to play in 1954, just showing how this had an influence post-war. At a University of Melbourne dramatic presentation, behind the scenes, I played the recorder, of G.K. Chesterton's drama, The Surprise. If you've seen the Father Brown stories on television, you know the what I call rather twee kind of story. But anyway, that was it. Pedram asked me to play my recorder here as an example of our internment archives. I've scarcely played it in the 40 years since coming to Canberra, but I'll try with my old stiff hands to give you some idea in honor of but however, in tribute to my original German foundation, I will first sing 2 of the 5 stanzas of a carol and then play this. I'm not a solo singer in public, but I'm going to show you what this project does for us. So I'm doing something that I don't do because of the vigor that we have received from doing this project. You'll have to imagine 4 voices in harmony. You can find it on YouTube. It's a beautiful song, Es ist ein Ros entsprungen. Very lovely. And you must realize that I don't have my bathroom acoustics here. Do we have time for me to sing these 2 lines? Let me see what the note is. Later on, I'm going to practice it with the wolves who are real singers, unlike myself. Es ist ein Ros entsprungen aus seiner Wurzel zart, wie es die Alten sungen, aus Jesse kam die Art und hat ein Blümlein bracht, mitten im kalten Winter, wohl zu der halben Nacht. Das Röslein, das ich meine, wovon Isia sprach, hat sie gebracht alleine, Marie die holde Magd. Auf Gottes ew'gem Brat hat sie ein Kind geboren, wohl zu der halben Nacht. Now, I'm getting to the end. I mean, there was a lot of prologue today, so I did actually time this for 35 minutes, but it's going to be later, so forgive me, please. Years later, after playing, now let me see, what was I thinking? Years after receiving the recorder, my husband was teaching at the University of Papua New Guinea, and I was a student there, and who lived 2 houses away from us, none other than a young child, a very young child named Genevieve Lacey. She has by now become internationally famous as a musician and is Australia's greatest recorder virtuoso with several different types of recorders, not just one little descant recorder. Her dad taught me Pacific history at the university. It amuses me to think that perhaps Genevieve, as a young child, may have heard me practice my simple recorder, and I used to play for 2 hours a fortnight with a pianist who liked the sound of it. So I played much better than I play now. That she may have heard me and thought as a little girl, that will be a lovely thing to do. Who knows? In my old age, now close to 88, the distant and the recent have a wonderful way of blending. I'm invigorated with a love of life, so that in old age, like others in our project, I think on internment, I feel emotionally in the middle of my life, as if to make up for past losses. My memory of past pain is put into a distant perspective. At this point, I must greet our associates from Barbara who are watching this talk, wherever they are, apparently. And I must acknowledge my grandson, Sam Robertson, with his girlfriend, Paola, because they are watching this program on Zoom from an island next to Mallorca in the Mediterranean Sea. I think that's so wonderful. Hello, Sam and Paola. And I must tell a small joke in tribute to Nicholas O'Neill, my dear friend of many years, expert on human rights in this room and in Australia in general. I have told this joke a few times before, but only Nick took it further in his disarmingly humane, logical finesse when I spoke to him by phone recently. This is the joke. In 1952, in my matriculation class at school, nobody knew of my background. It was hidden. We never spoke about our internment. The nuns protected me. No one knew I was German, okay? This girl called Pamela, who thought I was Spanish because of my looks, commented, "Helga, you should study law at university." "Why?" I asked, astonished. She said, "You would look great in a wig." I took it at that level, you know, as a 2-level thing, but Nick took it further and said to me, 70 years later, that Pamela Brady did have a point, that the words of lawyers who wear wigs, of course, are more important. So she did have a point. And I have to smile also at her daughter's disarmingly logical suggestion that if I had not been interned from Persia, I would not have met Pedram, nor have had an exotic story to tell you people here now. I just forgot to say something during the talk, and that is somewhere where I didn't read my script. As people accuse me of condoning my father's violence. I have never, ever condoned his violence on us. But I've come to the conclusion, partly through this project and in old age, that empathy for others is more important than feeling self-pity. The problem is his, not mine, in the end. So I also have to smile at her daughter's disarmingly logical suggestion. If I had not been interned from Persia, I would not have met Pedram, nor have had an exotic story to tell, or have you people here now to listen to me. So thank you for coming, and thank you, Pedram, for sharing your research with us and for suggesting the opening question in the title for this talk, Lost or Found. I am sure that you will all agree with me that what I have lost in my life has definitely been surpassed by what I have found. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Helga John. You stay with me, please.
Yeah,
So
okay.
probably there are
Oh,
questions.
isn't Nick going to say a few words about?
Oh, yes.
We asked him to summarize.
Oh, yes,
Didn't
please.
we? Yes.
Good evening, everybody. Summarising wasn't quite as I understood it, but I do want to make a few comments which I suspect will help raise your blood pressure, because I'm speaking about the perspective that I would understand the Australians of the time were facing. Anyway, I've had the pleasure of knowing Helga for many years. I first really met her in 1968 when she came to Papua New Guinea with her to teach with her husband to teach at the University of Papua New Guinea, Jim Griffin, who had been my history teacher for most of the time I did history at school. Look, I think it's important to appreciate when assessing the human rights situation, to appreciate that one of the positive things of World War II was a great move forward with human rights. Sorry. Okay. Was that it caused a great leap forward with human rights, but regrettably, most of you have lived through the time before those human rights had any chance of recognition. But let's look at the situation from the Australian point of view. The issue was that Iran, which I'll call it, was rich in oil and everyone wanted it. The British actually thought it was theirs, really, when you think about their attitudes after World War II, when Prime Minister Mossadegh, who had the temerity to suggest that this was actually Iranian and that reasonable prices should be paid to the Iranian community for the use of their natural resources. The reaction of the great and wonderful allies, the British and the Americans, was to get rid of Mossadegh and put in a government in the form of bringing back a Shah, which didn't do human rights in Iran a great deal of good in any way, and guaranteed that the British and the Americans would have access to Iranian oil. When Helga and her family were taken into custody, it was 1941. British and Russian soldiers were invading the area at the time because both of them wanted to get control of the oil. The Germans wanted to get control of the oil, and they were making their efforts, even though Germany and Russia had a pact from 1939. We all know now, and probably Hitler knew from 1939 on, that he needed this pact long enough to be strong enough to go into Soviet Russia as he did, but he found, like Napoleon, that it was rather harder to manage than you might have thought initially. Anyway, Britain wanted to, of course, deny Nazi Germany access to the Iranian oil and use it for itself. And Britain feared Germany's Third Reich wanted to conquer its then colony, the British then colony of India, which at the time included modern-day Pakistan, and so bordered on Iran. That's sometimes people, particularly Australians, whose view of geography is rather different from perhaps Europeans, is so close that Iran and India, as it then was, actually were. And that explains why Sir William Slim, who was the commander of the 10th Indian Brigade, took part in the conquest of what was called Abyssinia at the time by the British in 1940 and 1941. And he was the person commanding the forces that captured Helga and her parents and her brother. Some of you will recall, became a Governor General of Australia between 1953 and 1960. And I think it's really important that you insist that your stories get recorded and get told, and because they are part of this country's history. And we need those of us who brought up with perhaps a different view need to know about this. And also we need, as part of how Australia is developing into a multicultural country where the Europeans are less and less important every year, that we all learn to live in such a community, which is going to be a great thing. Some of us will be too old to see much of it, but the younger ones here will have the opportunity, if we all handle it well, for this country to be a place which deals with multicultural communities well. We need to take that seriously because so far we probably get a pass, but we certainly don't get high honours. Thank you.
So we might go to questions now. First in the room, if anyone has questions for Helga or Pedram, I'll be coming around, just raise your hand and I'll come around with a roving mic. Anything that you'd like to share as well, if you have personal connections as well. Oh yes, we'll definitely be doing the book signings at the end. I think also I saw a hand at the back.
Thank you. My name's Linda Briskman and I'm at Western Sydney University. Helga, thank you very much for your really moving and multi-layered account, and I'm just really impressed with your generosity, you know, not wanting to be seen as a victim and even at times trying to place yourself you know, through the lens of governments that were, you know, terrified of Nazi influence in Australia. I'm perhaps a little less generous because I can see the continuum of human rights abuses and injustices, and you alluded to that when you mentioned asylum seekers in particular. And just trying to connect the past with the present. I know it's very different and we're in an era now of mass media and social media and the internet. But something that's been a continuum in Australia, I think, is how the media or some parts of the media have colluded in human rights abuses and injustices in this country. So my question to you is really, how was the treatment of so-called enemy aliens portrayed in the Australian media at that time? And was there any, you know, resistance to this? You know, were people raising objections? Were there any social movements that were saying this is really incredibly unfair to be incarcerating innocent people and innocent children, which, you know, we're still doing today? Or did the mainstream of society either not know about it or just accept this was a necessary form of protection, you know, of Australian borders?
I was, of course, a child. I was 11 years old of the period you're talking about, from 11 to 20, I suppose.
Helga, could you move to the lectern, please?
I will do that. Okay.
We'll see you in the light.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. I didn't read newspapers. My father did not allow us to read newspapers. That was his property in our household. I never acquired a habit of reading the newspapers until later in life. Being in a Catholic school was the same. You know, politics was not for girls. So I am ignorant about what the press said at the time. I just know that we were very ashamed of having been German, having been the enemy, especially when the the crimes of the Nazi regime were revealed, and we hid ourselves, our identities, our language, and so on. We were incognito up to a point. People didn't know who I was. Years later, when I published at school, the girls who were at school with me were astonished. The story came out that I had never told to anybody. I did talk about it at university to the odd person, but not as strongly as I do now. So I can't really answer. Maybe Nick might know how the press related at that time. I just can't answer that question, how it was.
Maybe it's another project, Pedram.
Thank you. Part of our research, thank you. We'll start reading the newspapers of the period to see whether anything was known about Germans locked up in us. I don't think anybody knew of the internment camps. I talked to journalists in the 1980s that never heard of the internment camps. So I don't know whether the press knew about it. I doubt if they did, actually. So I can't answer your question.
Hi everyone. Hi Helga. Hi Pedram. My name's Ben. I'm also a lecturer here at Western Sydney Uni. Thank you for your time, and it's an amazing project.
Thank you.
Wonderful to hear about.
Thank you.
About it. I'm interested from both of you. What's the next iteration of this project? Are there some ideas that you have on what will happen next?
Here's the team leader here. Here we are. You're sharing this? No? Okay.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Ben. Also, my colleagues from our school, thank you for being here. Ben, since 2019, we began our project. When pandemic was disaster for everyone, it was great thing for our project because we had bi-weekly Zoom meetings and discussed the project. And in this stage where we are standing regarding your question, since 2019, each family like Helga, John and Roswitha and the other families, they looked at their family collections, what they have first. Maybe they knew there are some things, but they didn't in detail the content, what embedded in those things. Photographs, diaries, letters, many things. And now maybe we have 80% knowledge of what are in the collections. The first outcome of these 4 years will be an edited volume, which will publish hopefully spring next year by Litverlek, our publisher in Vienna, which is the diaries of parents that did they write before going to Iran in 1930s. What they did live in Iran between two wars, their observations in Iran between two wars, what happened during war, separation, their diaries in detention in Loveday camp, in Tatura camp, letters of communications between mothers and children in Germany and single fathers in the camp. So the first thing is our edited volume. As Helga mentioned a few weeks ago, thanks to our colleagues in Berry Barbara Council, hello colleagues, I know you are there, and Internment Loveday Camp team, we had a symposium, an exhibition during 3-4 days, 1-day symposium, big exhibition. Also, third year we work with children. All of the members of the project, we were there. We work with the children for impact, awareness. And every single member of project told their family stories, personal stories to different group of children and school kids. And we would love to continue our collaboration there. This is for project members because this is their project. But my beginning of work and next step beyond the book, we are discussing. Definitely we hope, because our school hosted the project since 2019. Project materials, majority are in our school, you know that. Pedram invaded all of the cupboards and shelves there. And my hope is that in a school, with collaboration of other colleagues, our students, library, we can create a good host place for the entire collection. and keep them invested in the university and open it for all of us, because the answers of our Linda is in the collection. Fathers, families collected Linda, what happened after the internment. In Australian news, they cut all of them and they have them. Children, they don't know. I'm, as the person who digging the collection and curator of collection, I know those details. There are a lot of journals and magazines and reports about Germans of Persia after war in Australia and enemy aliens there. So I hope, I know Adam was online. We are recording. Brian, thank you for your support, everyone. If you can keep the collection, the entire material in our school, university, I think we can do collectively together an amazing project.
Thank you. We've got a couple of comments from our online participants. Anne McLaughlin says, Carl and Carla, and you have to forgive my pronunciation, Haberkost were at Tatura Camp 3 from Singapore on Queen Mary, also interned during World War II at Burke and Molonglo. Kind regards, Anne McLaughlin. They have connections to Loveday and Barmera. And Diana Blom says, my cousin-in-law, an Austrian 16-year-old, being educated in England, was tapped on the shoulder at school and with his brother put on the Danera ship to Hay, Australia. So we've got people sharing the experiences. Yeah, that
Thank you
might
so
be similar.
much.
Jewish
Thank
people,
you.
yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
So no question from...
We can open it up. So if anyone would like to speak and ask a question, we can bring them up on the screen. I might have to make an adjustment.
Hello again, everyone. Helga is here. If you have any questions, suggestions, feedbacks. So, thank you. Emma, so is...
I think that wraps it up.
There is
Oh,
one
no, wait,
question.
one more.
Yes.
Hello. Just a short comment here to say that as someone who has been fortunate to get to know some of the members of the project as friends over the past couple of years outside of the project, I just wanted to say thank you, Helga, and everyone else here for being so brave to be able to share that story with us today. It was incredibly moving and courageous. And I just think how important it is that these stories are shared for future generations, and the impact that I think this project and your personal lived experiences will continue to make in this area of research and this part of this country's history. So thank you for being so brave and courageous and eloquent today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, everyone here in the room and online. For those who are here with us now, we invite you to look at the exhibition. If you have, please, I know you don't touch, but we watch, we don't touch. Helga will be with us. If you have any question on materials, please address your question to Helga. And in the same time, Helga will sign her book for those who wants to have a copy. I think my colleagues, they have some words before finishing this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Helga. We just wanted to present you with something to say
Oh,
thank you
no.
for sharing your story and on behalf of the library.
Oh, thank you.
I
I'm
really appreciate
amazed. Can I give you a hug?
Of course.
That is amazing because it was a great honor for me to be here to speak. Thank you so
Okay.
much. That is just amazing. Thank you.